Across much of Victorian England and in small towns all over Europe and America where those customs traveled, there was a singular, solemn tradition each winter. As the hearths were lit and the fires burned low, and the night pressed cold and dark against shutter and glass, families gathered to tell ghost stories. On Christmas Eve especially, the boundary between the living world and what lay beyond seemed thinner, and listeners leaned close as voices dropped to whispers. It was not cheerful carols or feast songs that echoed by the firelight, but tales of sorrow, loss, and something waiting beyond the world of the living. In those flickering flames, people found a strange comfort and acknowledgement that grief, love, and memory do not vanish with the body. Tonight, I invite you back to that world. Not a Christmas tale of joy or merriment. No wreaths, no bright decorations, no laughing children around a blazing hearth. Instead, a cold wind, a lonely house, a dying child, and a desperate mother who would cling to anything for another day of life. My name is Elizabeth, though I have long protected the names of those involved. But this story is theirs to tell, and to survive. I came across the details only because, in a dusty archive of newspaper clippings and town registry entries, I found a single reference dated December 24, 1892 that spoke of a man who walked the streets on Christmas Eve. A man in Victorian clothes, singing a mournful hymn at windows, outside houses where children lay gravely ill. No one knew his name. No one recognized the hymn. He vanished each year, but every Christmas, somewhere in that town, perhaps in your town, there would be a child teetering between death and hope. And that caroler would appear, lantern in hand, his breath misted in the cold air, singing that sorrowed melody. They say he was a grieving father, a man who had lost his own daughter many years before. The town records show a young girl, Clara Everwood, died on December 25, 1878. Her father, Thomas Everwood, never recovered. Neighbors recalled him wandering the streets at night, calling her name into the frost. The last entry for him was on December 24, 1892, just before a sudden disappearance. No funeral. No coffin. No goodbye. Only an empty house and the lingering echo of a lost voice. Quiet pause, only fire crackling and wind outside. In 1910, an elderly woman named Agnes Glenn moved into what had been the Everwood residence. She told a local journalist years later that on every Christmas Eve she heard soft humming outside her windows. A hymn she had never heard before, but found herself humming in her sleep afterward. The journalist dismissed it as folklore. But the belief remained: some losses never fade. Some souls never rest. And so I ask you, if you hear a lonely voice outside your window this Christmas Eve, a hymn carrying over frost-edged glass, listen. But do not look. Because for one innocent child, it may be salvation. And for someone else, a price no living heart ever agreed to pay. This is not a cheerful ghost story. It is not meant to comfort. It is meant to warn. And to remember. Why this story echoes real tradition. I opened this tale with reference to real-world traditions. In the Victorian era, it was common to tell ghost stories during Christmas gatherings. As historical research shows, the popularity of printed ghost stories around Christmas soared in Victorian England, when the newly affordable printing press and rising literacy allowed tales of ghosts and spirits to reach many homes. The records I found later would describe the winter of 1892 as one of the coldest the region had ever endured. Snow weighed on rooftops like a burden, and the river froze solid for the first time in decades. It was the kind of cold that made sound travel strangely. Every footstep seemed too loud, every whisper seemed to linger long after the speaker fell silent. And it was in that same winter that a young woman named Beatrice Lawson arrived with her daughter, Lila, searching for a quieter life in a quieter town. She was not the sort of woman who chased superstition. She believed in the world she could see, the world of medicine, work, and perseverance. But the world she entered had its own traditions, older than she realized. Soft creak of old wooden floorboards. She rented a narrow, drafty house on Elmwood Lane. 2 small rooms, a kitchen, a stove barely large enough to heat a kettle. The house was inexpensive because most tenants never stayed long. Not because of violence or crime the town was safe, but because of the nights. Nights when the wind changed direction. Nights when a low voice drifted across the snow. Very faint humming is heard, unrecognizable, soft. Neighbors didn't speak of it openly. They only warned new arrivals of one thing. If you hear singing outside your window on Christmas Eve, don't open your curtains. Some said it kindly, others with a tremble in their breath. But Beatrice brushed it aside. She had more pressing matters, far more pressing. Pause. Fire pops. Her daughter had been ill since early childhood. A fever that rose and fell without warning. Hospital bills she couldn't pay. Medicines that soothed the symptoms, but never cured. By Christmas of that year, Lila's condition had worsened. Her breathing grew shallow. She slept more than she woke. And when she did wake, her eyes had a distant, unfocused look as if she were drifting somewhere between here and someplace else. There are diary entries from neighbors, individuals who lived near the Lawson house, describing how Beatrice spent her nights. She would sit by the small bed, a damp cloth in one hand, a candle burning low, whispering stories to keep her daughter awake. Stories of warmth, light, and springtime. She tried to speak hope into a room that had forgotten the sound of it. Townsfolk later recalled her figure through the frosted window, a silhouette bent over a child's bedside, hour after hour. A slow breath. A shift. The town doctor visited twice that month. On the second visit, his notes become hesitant. He wrote that the child was entering a stage from which she may not recover. He advised Beatrice to prepare for the worst. But there are things that mothers refuse to accept, even when the world insists otherwise. Long, emotional pause. By the night of December 24th, the temperature had fallen so sharply that the very air seemed brittle. Branches cracked under the weight of ice. Lamps flickered. The entire town felt still, as if holding its breath. Inside the Lawson house, the fire had burned down to embers. Lila's fever climbed again. Her breaths came shallow. And Beatrice, exhausted, frightened, and praying for a miracle she did not dare speak aloud, laid her head beside her daughter's hand. A low, distant tone begins almost like a single note of a hymn. It happened just after midnight. At first, Beatrice assumed she was dreaming. A sound drifting through her mind, soft, low, drawn out, mournful. But the sound did not fade. It grew clearer. And with a quiet, aching certainty, she realized it was coming from just outside the house. Voice lowers to a whisper. A man's voice. Not young. Not strong. But steady. And full of sorrow so deep it seemed to carry the winter with it. A single, faint footstep in the snow. Beatrice lifted her head. She listened. The hymn had no recognizable melody. Not English. Not Latin. Something older. A tune shaped by grief. The very walls of the house seemed to draw the sound inward the way cold seeps through cracks. And then she realized Lila was breathing easier. Heart-softening pause. Her chest, moments before struggling, now rose and fell with gentle rhythm. The furrow in her forehead eased. A calm washed over her face, calm so pure that it frightened Beatrice more than the fever ever had. Wind rises softly outside. Beatrice moved quietly to the window. She didn't open the curtains. Only placed her fingertips on the cold glass. The singing grew louder. And as she listened, with a mother's instincts fighting every reasonable thought, she became aware of a glow. A warm, shifting glow coming from the other side of the frost. Lantern-like flicker. It was the glow of a lantern, held by a man standing just beyond the windowpane. Beat. Then another. She could see the outline of a hat. A long coat. The edge of a scarf that moved gently with the wind. The lantern light swayed, illuminating only fragments of his figure through the ice. But the voice was unmistakable. Hum grows slightly louder. Beatrice's heart pounded. Every part of her wanted to open the curtains to see him fully, to understand why her dying child had suddenly found breath again. But something about the hymn held her still. As if the music itself warned her that seeing more than this silhouette would change everything. A slow inhale from the narrator. She stepped back from the window. The lantern glow dimmed. And the singing faded, not abruptly, but gently, like a memory sinking beneath deep water. Silence. When she returned to Lila's bedside, the child was sleeping peacefully. Her fever had broken. The color in her cheeks had returned. And for the first time in months, Beatrice saw her daughter smile in her sleep. Another long, emotional pause. That night should have been a miracle. A blessing. Something to celebrate. But eyewitness accounts from others in the town, those who had once heard the same hymn, told a different story. For every child who regained their strength, Beatrice would not understand this for another year. Not until the caroler returned. Not until the quiet truth began to unravel. And not until she realized that every breath Lila took was taken from someone else. Fade out. Wind intensifies, then quiets. In the days after that Christmas Eve, neighbors spoke of the change in the Lawson house with quiet amazement. Lila, who had spent months too weak to lift her head, now walked through the snow with a child's energy. She laughed. She played. She ran her palms across frosted windows just to watch the patterns melt beneath her touch. Her recovery was so sudden that some believed Beatrice had found a new physician. Others whispered that perhaps the illness had simply run its course. But a few, the older residents, exchanged looks that were not joyful. They recognized the signs. Soft creaking of a chair. One such resident, Mrs. Agnes Glenn, lived 2 houses down. In her youth, she had been a schoolteacher, known for her strict manner and sharper memory. She had seen 3 families before the Lawsons move into that house. And she had seen all 3 children recover from illnesses that should have been their end. And each time, she had watched a parent fade. A slow exhale. She waited a full week before approaching Beatrice. She found her outside, hanging linens on a line despite the cold. The wind tugged at the cloth, and Beatrice, pale and weary-eyed, fought to pin them down. Mrs. Glenn later described the moment as unsettling, not because Beatrice looked unwell, but because she looked older. Not by years, but by decades of exhaustion layered into her face. "You should rest," Mrs. Glenn had told her. But Beatrice only smiled, thin and grateful. "I will," she said. "I just haven't been sleeping well." She brushed it away. Blamed late nights, worry, the winter air. But there was something about her voice, the unsteady quality, the trembling beneath her words, that stayed with Mrs. Glenn long after she walked home. Silence for a few seconds. Strange things began happening in the weeks that followed. Beatrice would forget conversations she'd had earlier that day. She misplaced items constantly, keys, letters, even the kettle on the stove. She told a neighbor she felt hollow, a word she never used again. The town physician visited once more, this time at the neighbor's request. His notes mentioned fatigue, weakness, accelerated aging, but no known illness. Beatrice was 32. She looked close to 50. A faint ticking of a clock. Meanwhile, Lila blossomed. She gained weight. Her cheeks filled with color. Even her hair seemed brighter. And she never once remembered being sick. When asked about Christmas Eve, she only said, "I heard a song, but I don't think it was a dream." When told to hum it, she could not. The melody eluded her. Wind shifts direction outside. It was in mid-January that Beatrice first visited the local library. She was not a woman who had time for reading, but something inside her had been gnawing at her since Christmas Eve, a feeling she could not name. She asked the librarian if any books described local winter traditions, or old customs from the region. The librarian, a quiet man who rarely spoke to strangers, led her to a shelf of town records and folklore archives. Pages turning softly. Hours passed. The candles burned low. And then, she found it. A thin volume published privately in 1908, titled Hymns of the Forgotten Midwinter. Most of the entries were stories, personal accounts, fables, poems collected from older residents. But on the final pages, handwritten in fading ink, was an account from an unnamed author describing a man who walked the streets on Christmas Eve in the late 19th century. A man seen outside the windows of homes where a child lay gravely ill. The account described his clothing: a tall hat, a heavy coat, a scarf wrapped tightly around his neck. He carried a lantern with a peculiar flicker, as though the flame were struggling to stay alive.
He never knocked.
He never sought shelter.
He simply stood in the snow and sang.
A faint, eerie note of a hymn returns. There were details that sent a cold ripple through Beatrice's body. The children he visited always regained their strength.
The parents always fell ill afterward. And many did not recover. The account mentioned only one name associated with the figure: Thomas Everwood,
a man whose daughter had died on Christmas Day, 1878. According to local registry records, he was last seen on December 24, 1892, the same night several families reported hearing an unknown hymn outside their windows.
Soft pause.
Beatrice closed the book slowly. She sat there for a long time, her hands trembling, her breath shallow.
She did not want to believe the connection.
But as she pressed her fingers to her own tired face, she felt the undeniable truth.
Something inside her was fading.
And it had begun the moment the hymn first drifted through her window.
The fire popped sharply.
When she returned home that evening, Lila ran into her arms. Her energy was vibrant, almost startling. Beatrice held her tightly, her arms weak around the child who felt stronger each day. A quiet dread settled in her heart.
Not of ghosts, nor folklore, but of arithmetic. Gains and losses. One life rising. One life falling. Weeks turned into months. Spring thaw arrived. Then summer.
And though no one spoke it aloud, the older residents kept watch on Beatrice as the months passed the way one watches a candle burn shorter.
In a drafty room.
By the time the leaves turned red and gold again, she struggled to climb the hill to the market. Her hair, once dark and thick, had turned almost entirely silver. And she began waking with bruises she could not explain.
A single deep breath.
On December 10, Mrs. Glenn finally visited her, bringing warm broth and bread. And for the first time, Beatrice asked the question she had been avoiding for nearly a year.
Last Christmas, the singing. Have you heard it before?
Mrs. Glenn's voice older, quiet.
Yes, the woman answered.
And you should not have listened.
A very long silence. Beatrice didn't argue.
She only stared at the window at the frost forming along the edges, the faint draft that crept around the frame. The same spot where the lantern's glow had appeared almost 1 year ago.
Mrs. Glenn placed a hand on her shoulder.
And in a voice barely above a whisper, she said,
"He will come again."
A soft gasp of the winter wind. The days grew shorter.
The nights grew colder.
And as Christmas approached, Beatrice's strength waned. She brushed her hair one morning and found clumps of it left in the comb. She walked across a room and felt her legs weaken beneath her. She looked into the mirror and saw a woman she did not recognize.
Fire crackles gently. Yet Lila flourished.
Bright, lively, growing faster than the other children. Each laugh, each smile, each leap into her mother's arms felt like sunlight. And every time Beatrice held her, she wondered,
how much more of me has she taken unknowingly? The thought was not resentment. It was grief.
A grief that settled in her bones as the season changed.
Wind rises. And then on the evening of December 24th, exactly 1 year after the first hymn,
Beatrice woke in her chair beside the window, chilled to her core. The fire had burned down.
The room was cold. And outside, a single lantern flickered in the dark.
Soft, steady narration tone like a late-night investigative storyteller speaking low enough to keep you awake, but uneasy. When Beatrice finally gathered the courage to look through the window,
the night outside was empty.
But something had changed.
The glass felt cold, colder than winter should allow.
And the air carried a faint echo so soft she first mistook it for her own breath.
A single note, drawn out, held as though someone were trying not to let go.
She stood there frozen, unsure if she should look deeper into the dark, or step back before the darkness looked back at her. For the rest of that night, the house did not sleep.
Not really. Mara's sudden recovery brought relief, yes.
But beneath that relief, a quiet dread began to nest.
Not because something terrible was happening,
but because something unexplained had already begun.
Beatrice tried to dismiss it.
A strange man.
A strange song. A strange night.
Yet as she prepared breakfast, Mara hummed the same melody she'd heard the night before.
A melody a child should not know.
"Sweetheart, where did you learn that?"
Mara shrugged, cheerfully. I didn't. It's just in my head.
The tone, the pitch identical. As if the child had absorbed the sound directly. And then something else happened, something so small it might have gone unnoticed if Beatrice weren't already alert.
Every clock in the house ticked 1 second slower.
Barely a difference. But enough that the room felt out of rhythm, offbeat, tilted.
She tapped one of the clocks.
The ticking corrected itself for a moment, then slipped again, dragging behind the world outside. It was the first sign that time itself had been touched. But she wouldn't understand that until much later. Later that afternoon, Beatrice made her way through town. But everywhere she went, people avoided her eyes.
Not out of rudeness. But caution. Recognition. Sympathy.
It was only when she entered the old general store at the edge of Maple Row that someone finally spoke. Mrs. Carraway, white-haired, frail, and known for talking too much, went silent the moment she saw her.
Then in a hushed voice. You heard him, didn't you?
Beatrice stopped cold.
Who? Mrs. Carraway didn't answer right away.
She simply pointed to the far wall behind the counter. It was a pinboard filled with old newspaper clippings.
Yellowed articles from decades past.
All of them marked by the same date.
December 24th. December 24th. December 24th. Mrs. Carraway whispered. He comes every year, but only to certain homes.
Beatrice's fingers trembled as she reached for one clipping.
An article from 1956.
Local boy miraculously recovers after sudden illness. Family reports hearing a lone caroler outside their window moments before improvement.
Another article from 1979.
Child saved after long fever. Witness describes a man in old-fashioned clothes singing a weeping hymn no one knew. Then a smaller clipping, nearly torn at the edges.
1992. Woman dies unexpectedly weeks after daughter's unexplained recovery. Neighbors recall the same Victorian figure. The room tilted slightly as she read. That subtle drag in the clocks. That strange chill.
Those were not coincidences. They were markers.
Patterns.
Mrs. Carraway touched her arm gently.
We don't speak his name. We don't know his name. But we know what he wants. Beatrice swallowed hard. And what is that?
The old woman hesitated, then answered.
Time. Borrowed time. When Beatrice returned home, Mara was at the kitchen table, drawing. Look, Mommy. She held up a page.
A stick figure drawing.
A man in a long Victorian coat. Tall. Thin. Standing outside their house. A hat shadowing his face. And next to him, a smaller figure. A little girl. Not Mara. Not Beatrice. Someone else's child. Beatrice knelt beside her. Honey, who is that?
Mara tapped her crayon against the small girl's head.
She's the one he sings for.
A cold feeling rippled through her, something like understanding beginning to bloom.
And how do you know that? Mara smiled innocently. Because she told me. The house seemed to breathe inward, every board tightening as if listening. Beatrice fought the urge to grab her daughter and run. But where would she go? And from whom?
That evening, the sun sank early behind thick winter clouds. The neighborhood grew still, as if waiting.
Doors locked, curtains drawn, lights dimmed. Even the wind had quieted.
By midnight, Beatrice had forced herself to stay awake in the living room.
One lamp on. Every curtain closed.
But at 12:14 a.m., she heard it again.
One single note. Held, stretched, lingering.
I know you're there, she whispered, though her voice barely carried.
And then the singing began. Not loud. Not forceful. Soft. Measured. Grief woven into every syllable.
She couldn't understand the words.
The language felt old, worn with age.
But the melody seemed to press its hand gently against the walls of the house, as if searching for an entrance. Through the thin veil of curtains, a faint shadow passed across the window.
Not close. Not distant. Slow. Almost patient. Mara slept in her room. Breathing steady. Heart beating strong.
Beatrice felt her own pulse stumble. She stepped toward the window, each footfall careful, quiet. When she reached it, she only lifted the curtain an inch.
Just enough. Through the small gap, she saw the man. He wasn't looking at the house. He wasn't looking at the window.
He was staring directly at her. His eyes weren't angry.
They weren't hollow. They were tired.
So impossibly tired. Like someone who had spent years searching for something he could never find.
The singing stopped.
He tilted his head slightly,
as if acknowledging that she could see him clearly now. Then,
he took one step backward.
Another.
And as he retreated into the dark, the clocks in the house began to tick normally again.
The air warmed.
The tension in the boards loosened.
But Beatrice didn't sleep. Because she knew now. He wasn't visiting by accident. He wasn't simply passing through. He had chosen their home. And he would return again.
Until the debt was paid. The next day, she made her way to the only place in town that kept records older than the cemetery itself. The Historical Society building. A narrow stone structure that smelled of dust and forgotten winters. Inside, she met Evan Calder, the archivist, soft-spoken, meticulous, and known for never throwing anything away. When she described the man she saw,
the coat, the hat, the mournful song,
Evan slowly removed his glasses.
I've heard those reports. Every local historian has.
But I don't think you came here for rumors. He pulled a thick ledger from a locked cabinet. The spine was cracked, the pages browned and fragile.
Christmas records. 1870 to 1900.
He flipped carefully until one page stopped him cold.
December 25, 1892. An entry written in tight handwriting. Daughter of Elias Whitford passed in the early hours of Christmas morning after long illness.
Father seen wandering the streets singing an unfamiliar hymn believed to be of foreign origin. Several residents report hearing him at their windows through the night. Then another line added later, in different ink.
Father did not recover from grief. Declared missing within the week. Beatrice read the final note.
Some say he searches still. A chill pricked the back
of her neck.
The melody she heard.
The shadow outside. The drawings. The recovery. Everything aligned.
Evan watched her carefully.
Miss Hargrove, has your daughter been ill? She nodded. And she recovered suddenly? Another nod. Evan closed the ledger gently as if sealing away something dangerous. Then I'm afraid you already know what this means.
Beatrice lowered her voice.
I'm going to lose something, aren't I? Evan didn't speak for a moment.
Then softly.
Not lose. Trade.
Evan's words lingered in the air far longer than they should have.
Not lose. Trade.
Beatrice felt the meaning settle into her chest.
Not like a blow, but like a truth she had already suspected.
For a moment, neither of them spoke.
The quiet hum of the old building filled the silence. Every sound suddenly magnified.
The distant radiator clicking. The shifting of old wood beams above their heads.
Finally, Beatrice exhaled. What kind of trade?
Evan rested both hands on the closed ledger, as if grounding himself. He searches for children whose time is running short.
He doesn't take their lives. He gives them more. But borrowed time must be paid back. Always. Beatrice felt lightheaded. So he takes. She couldn't finish the sentence. Evan didn't make her. The parent who answers him. Or the one who fears the most. It's never immediate. It's never violent. It's gradual. Like years being quietly poured from one life into another. He hesitated, then added more quietly.
And no one ever realizes it until it's already begun. Beatrice walked home with the winter air tightening her lungs.
The streets looked the same snow-dusted sidewalks, dim streetlights, wreaths hanging from doorways.
But now everything felt thinner, like the town had layers she had never seen before. A passing car slowed for a moment beside her.
An older man rolled down the window. You the young woman from the cabin off Hawthorne Ridge? She nodded cautiously.
He swallowed, eyes full of something like sympathy.
Keep your daughter close. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a threat.
It was advice from someone who knew more than he wished to.
The car drove off without another word.
And for the rest of the walk, Beatrice felt watched not by something close,
but by something patient.
When she stepped into the house, she found Mara sitting cross-legged on the living room carpet, surrounded by more drawings.
Beatrice knelt down, her hands already trembling. Mara, what are you doing?
Her daughter smiled.
I'm drawing the girl again. Beatrice's heart sank.
Which girl?
The one he's looking for. Beatrice sat still for a moment before speaking. Did he tell you that? Mara shook her head. No. She did. Beatrice felt her mouth go dry. You spoke to her?
Mara nodded softly, as if this were the most natural thing in the world.
She doesn't sound like a kid, though. She sounds tired.
Like she's been waiting a long time. Beatrice stared at the drawing.
The girl was clearer this time. Not just lines and shapes, but details.
A small bow in her hair.
A winter dress. Shoes from another era. And eyes that seemed far too knowing for a child. Mara, she whispered, what does she want?
Her daughter shrugged.
She just keeps asking if I'm okay.
That answer was somehow worse.
That night, Beatrice didn't plan to sleep. She made tea.
She turned on soft lights. She sat on the couch, blankets wrapped around her shoulders, waiting for the first note of that melody to slip through the cold air.
But hours passed quietly. No song. No shadow. No tapping on the window.
Instead, around 2:30 a.m., something else changed. The house felt lighter.
As if every room had exhaled at the same time. Beatrice stood and listened. Nothing. No wind. No footsteps. No distant singing.
She stepped to the window, expecting darkness.
Instead,
snow was falling gently across the yard.
And standing at the far end of the property, barely visible through the drifting flakes, was a little girl.
The same silhouette Mara had been drawing.
She wasn't moving. She wasn't crying.
She was simply standing there, staring at the house.
Her small figure outlined by the faint glow of the street lamp. Beatrice's pulse hammered.
Mara, she whispered under her breath, stay asleep, please just stay asleep.
She slowly opened the door.
Cold air rushed inside, sharp, metallic.
The girl didn't step toward her. Didn't flinch. She just whispered one word. Barely audible above the falling snow. Thank you.
Beatrice froze.
For what?
The girl tilted her head, expression unreadable.
For giving him hope. A gust of icy wind swept across the yard. And in the blink of an eye, the girl was gone.
Vanished so quietly the snow around her didn't even shift.
Beatrice backed inside, slammed the door, locked it twice. And leaned against it, shaking. Hope for what? For whom? For how long?
The next morning, she returned to the Historical Society.
Evan wasn't surprised to see her.
I need more, she whispered.
Everything you have.
He motioned her to follow him deeper into the archives, past rows of boxes and forgotten relics. They stopped at a small metal drawer labeled
Whitford 1892. Inside were only 3 documents and 1 photograph. A photograph of Elias Whitford and his daughter. Beatrice gasped. It was the same child Mara had been drawing. The same face she'd seen in the snow last night. Evan handed her a small handwritten letter. Found in Elias's coat after he disappeared. She unfolded it carefully. If my voice keeps her near, I shall sing until I am nothing but the sound itself. Below it, another line written shakily, as if added much later. Let the ones who love their children borrow what time I could not give mine. Beatrice felt tears burning her eyes. He wasn't trying to harm anyone, she whispered. Evan nodded. No. He was trying to finish what he couldn't. He was trying to give someone else the gift he failed to give his own daughter. Beatrice looked at him, her voice cracking. But at what cost? Evan hesitated, then stepped closer. At the cost of someone who loves enough to give what he no longer can. The meaning landed. Heavy. Precise. Irreversible. Mara's recovery wasn't a miracle. It was a transfer. A trade already underway. Beatrice felt her throat tighten. How much time is he taking? Evan lowered his gaze. Enough. That evening, as Beatrice prepared dinner, she noticed the kitchen clock lagging again. 1 second behind. Then 2. Then 3. When she touched the metal frame, it was warm. Not overheated. Not malfunctioning. Warm. As if something had passed through it. She walked through the house checking the other clocks. Every one of them had fallen behind at different rates. Minutes missing. Not seconds. Oh God, she whispered. It's already happening. Mara's voice floated from the living room. Mommy, can you help me with the puzzle? Her voice was cheerful. Full. Alive. Beatrice closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. She knew what was happening now. And she knew the truth she hadn't allowed herself to say out loud. Time wasn't being taken. It was being given away. Her time. For the rest of that evening, Beatrice moved through the house quietly. Listening. Observing. Calculating every sound, every shadow, every shift in the air. Nothing felt normal anymore. Even the walls seemed to breathe differently. As if they knew something she hadn't yet admitted. Mara was humming again. The same melody. A small, innocent version of the hymn that had entered their home 2 nights before. And with every note the child sang, Beatrice felt another heartbeat slip away from her own chest. Not taken. Given. Given freely. Unknowingly. Irreversibly. Later, after putting Mara to bed, Beatrice sat alone at the dining table. The house was silent. But her thoughts were not. Evan's words replayed like a whisper caught in a loop. Borrowed time must be paid back. She pressed her palms to her temples. She didn't care about superstition. She didn't care about ghost stories, old legends, forgotten grief. She cared about one thing. Her daughter was alive. Alive in a way she had not been for months. Running. Smiling. Breathing deep. Color returning to her cheeks. Beatrice swallowed hard. If this miracle came with a cost, she would pay it. But she needed to know how. And when. And how much time she still had left. As she stood to clean the table, she caught her reflection in the window's dark glass. And for the first time, she noticed something she hadn't before. The faintest strand of gray hair near her temple. She leaned closer. Her breath fogged the glass. Her pulse quickened. Another strand. And another. Not many. But enough to feel like a warning. Rather than an aging. She touched the glass gently.
Her reflection looked back at her, with eyes that seemed just a little more tired, more faded. As if days had passed in minutes. As if the clocks weren't the only things losing time. The air behind her shifted. She turned quickly. Nothing there. Not a sound. Not a movement. Just the house. Watching her. Waiting. The next day, she walked to the town square. Hoping for answers. But expecting silence. Instead, whispers followed her. People stepping aside. People watching her with the same expression she'd seen in the general store. Recognition. Resignation. A strange blend of sadness. And respect. Finally, a man in his 70s approached her, removing his cap. "You're the woman from Hawthorne Ridge." She nodded slowly. "You've heard him." Another nod. He exhaled, long and heavy. "He chose you." Beatrice felt her chest tighten. "What does that mean?" The old man lowered his voice. "It means he thinks you're strong enough for the trade. Strong enough to love your child more than your fear." Her breath trembled. "How do I make it stop?" He shook his head. "You don't. There's no stopping. There's only giving. Or refusing." "What happens if I refuse?" His eyes softened. "Then your daughter returns to the path she was on before he came." The words hit her like ice water. He added quietly, almost like an apology. "And children rarely survive the path he interrupts." Beatrice looked away, swallowing the burn rising in her throat. She already knew that. She just needed someone else to say it plainly. As she walked away, the old man called after her. "If he hasn't taken much yet, you still have time to choose." Time. The very thing she was losing. That night, the snow fell heavier, soft flakes drifting like forgotten pieces of the past. Beatrice sat awake again, watching the window. At 12:09 a.m., she saw movement near the tree line. The girl. Standing in the same place she had before. Not approaching. Not advancing. Just waiting. Beatrice wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and stepped outside. The cold hit her immediately, sharp as glass. When she reached the edge of the yard, the girl finally looked up. Her voice was softer tonight. "You're fading." Beatrice swallowed. "How much time do I have?" The girl didn't answer directly. Instead, she glanced toward Mara's window. She needs more. He can only give her what is offered. Beatrice knelt down to the child's level, though her knees trembled in the freezing snow. "Will she know?" she whispered. The girl shook her head gently. "No one ever knows. Not until they're older. They hear the song, but they don't remember the words." Beatrice felt tears threatening. "I just want her to live." The girl stepped closer in the snow. Her small hand reaching out. Not touching. Just offering comfort. "That's why he chose you." Her voice wavered, like someone speaking through distance. "He wanted to save me. But he didn't know how. He only learned after we were apart." Beatrice's breath caught. "You're his daughter." The girl hesitated, then nodded once. "He doesn't hear me anymore." "Not fully. He hears only the part that aches. That searches." Her voice thinned. "You can give your daughter what he couldn't give me." Beatrice shut her eyes. Her decision wasn't made at that moment. It had been made the moment the fever left Mara's body. The moment she heard that impossible hymn. Her choice had already been written. When she opened her eyes again, the girl was gone. But the melody. That soft, ancient melody. Began drifting through the trees. Not loud. Not ominous. More like a father calling a child he had lost. A song shaped by longing rather than threat. Beatrice felt her heart shift. Not with fear.
but with compassion. She walked back to the house slowly, the snow crunching beneath her boots. And when she stepped inside, the clocks all stopped at once. Every second frozen. Every pendulum still. The air held its breath. As if the entire house was waiting for her answer. She whispered into the quiet. "I'm ready." And somewhere outside, the singing grew just a little brighter. Not happier, but clearer. As if he had finally heard exactly what he'd been waiting for. For the rest of the night, the house remained silent. Not the natural kind of silence, but the heavy, expectant quiet of something listening. Something waiting for the moment she would take her next step. Beatrice didn't sleep. She sat near Mara's door, knees pulled to her chest, watching the slow rise and fall of her daughter's breathing from across the hall. The girl slept peacefully. Too peacefully for a child who had been fighting for her life just days before. Beatrice watched her, memorizing every detail of her face. Every eyelash. Every faint curl in her hair. Every small sound she made when she shifted beneath the blanket. A part of her wondered. Is this the last time I get to see her like this? Unaware, safe, untouched by the truth breathing at the edges of our home? Another part whispered. This is why you're giving your years away. So she never has to see the darkness you're learning to carry. When the sun rose, it brought no warmth. Light spilled across the living room floor. But it felt pale, distant. As if traveling a longer road than usual to reach them. Beatrice stepped into the kitchen, expecting the clocks to resume their ticking. Instead, every one of them remained frozen. Same minute. Same second. 12:17. Time had stopped keeping track of itself. Or rather, time was waiting for her to acknowledge its new direction. She carefully placed her hand over the largest clock. Its surface was cold again, no warmth, no pulse. But beneath her palm, she felt something faint. Not a heartbeat. A pull. Like the subtle tug of an unseen thread connecting her life to something outside the walls of her home. Something ancient. Something grieving. She pulled her hand back quickly. Not out of fear, but because she finally understood. The exchange had already begun. Her years were moving. Not forward, but outward. By midday, she noticed something else. Mara was brighter. Not just healthier. Brighter in a way that didn't feel entirely natural. Color in her cheeks. Energy in her steps. Eyes clearer than she'd seen in months. Almost glowing with renewed vitality. She ran through the house with a freedom Beatrice hadn't seen since before the hospital visits. Before the nights spent in worry. Before the prayers whispered into dark rooms asking for one more day. "Mommy! Look how fast I can go." Mara darted from room to room, spinning, laughing. Beatrice watched with her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles whitened. Joy and sorrow existed in the same moment. Intertwined so painfully that she struggled to breathe. Every burst of laughter from her daughter felt like a piece of her own life being handed over in return. And she accepted it. Without hesitation. Without regret. But not without ache. That afternoon, she returned once more to the Historical Society. Evan met her before she even spoke. "You've decided." It wasn't a question. She nodded. "I have." Evan exhaled softly, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "There's something you need to understand before you continue." Beatrice's chest tightened. What else could there be? He retrieved a thin journal from the bottom shelf wrapped in old twine, its cover cracked. This is from 1903. The last recorded case where someone willingly gave their years. Beatrice hesitated before opening it. Inside were only a few pages handwritten with uneven ink. A mother describing how her daughter recovered from an illness. How the clocks in their home began slowing. How her hair grayed in strands before she reached 30. How she grew weaker each season while her daughter flourished. Then the final entry. He does not take all at once. He takes in pieces. A winter. A summer. A handful of mornings. A year in fragments.
Until the child has enough to stand without the borrowed time.
And the parent has nothing left to give.
Below it, another line barely legible. I do not fear what waits for me. I fear only leaving her with questions she can never answer. Beatrice closed the journal slowly. Evan watched her, eyes gentle.
You won't feel the loss at first. It will be gradual. But it will come. And once it begins, it cannot be undone. She nodded. I know. You should tell someone. A friend. A neighbor. Someone to help her later. Beatrice shook her head. No. If anyone else knows, they'll try to stop me.
Beatrice. This is mine, she whispered.
My decision. My child. My time. That evening, the snow returned. Falling heavier, faster. Thick flakes drifting like quiet messengers from another century. Beatrice didn't wait this time.
She stood by the living room window long before midnight.
Watching the yard. Feeling the weight in her chest grow. At 12:03 a.m., the melody began. Soft. Low. Sorrowful but no longer searching. Tonight, it was answering. The figure appeared near the tree line. The same outline she had seen before. Hat brim low. Coat trailing in the snow. He didn't walk toward the house. He waited. As if giving her the chance to come to him. Beatrice pulled on her coat. Stepped into the cold. And walked toward the voice. The air around him shimmered slightly. Not glowing. Not shifting. Just vibrating softly. As if the world itself recognized him. When she stopped a few feet away, the singing faded. He didn't speak. Not with words. But his eyes moved. To Mara's window. Then to Beatrice. Then to the sky. Understanding passed between them. He was asking without asking. Are you willing? Do you accept this path? Do you give what time remains?
Beatrice's throat tightened. Her answer came without hesitation.
Yes.
The wind stilled. The snow paused midair for the briefest breath.
And for the first time, Elias Whitford bowed his head. Not as a ghost demanding a price.
As a father acknowledging another. He extended one hand slowly.
Not touching her. Not taking from her. Just offering a point of connection. A bridge.
Beatrice moved closer. Until her fingertips brushed the air above his palm.
It felt warm. Alive.
A pull started immediately.
Gentle at first. Barely noticeable. Like losing a breath. She meant to keep. Like a memory slipping from reach.
She felt her knees weaken slightly.
Her pulse slow.
She whispered, voice trembling.
Will she be safe? Elias nodded once.
A slow, measured promise.
And she will live. He nodded again.
A tear slid down her cheek.
Then take what you need.
The wind carried her words away like a vow. The pull deepened.
Not painful. But undeniable.
A thread being unraveled from within her.
And through the window behind them,
Mara shifted in her sleep.
Her breathing deepening.
Her dreams steadying.
Health flowing inward. As time flowed outward. Beatrice's time. Her years. Her life. Piece by piece. Freely given.
Soft, low, almost like speaking beside the listener in the dark.
I didn't understand it at the time. Not fully. Not in a way any parent could accept without breaking open inside.
But the next morning something changed. Beatrice awoke before her alarm, something she hadn't done in weeks. She sat upright in bed, blinking slowly as though she'd been watching her own dreams from a distance. And her daughter, Lily. She was standing in the hallway, holding her stuffed rabbit, laughing.
Laughing.
Beatrice nearly collapsed. She touched her daughter's face, her forehead, her hands, checking for fever, checking for weakness, checking for anything at all that would explain the sudden shift.
But Lily looked normal.
As though the night before had been a dream Beatrice forced on herself. There was color in her cheeks again.
Her breathing didn't rattle.
Her eyes tracked the light. Everything about her reflected a kind of life Beatrice hadn't seen in months.
Still, there was something off. Subtle.
Easy to miss unless you were a mother who watched every breath your child took.
Lily hummed. A tiny melody. Soft. Faint. A pattern of notes Beatrice had never heard before. A tune too old to belong to cartoons. Too steady to be a random mumbled tune. Too sorrowful to come from a happy child.
Beatrice leaned closer.
"Sweetheart, what song is that?"
Lily shrugged.
"I don't know, Mommy, it's just in my head."
But as Lily walked toward the kitchen, the hairs on Beatrice's arms lifted.
Because that tune, the exact same one, was the one she had heard outside her bedroom window the night before.
She remembered the caroller's shadow. The way his posture never changed.
The way the hymn didn't match anything she'd ever heard before. Beatrice stepped toward the window again. Nothing. Only winter air. Bare branches. A quiet street. But somewhere she felt it. The presence hadn't left. It simply moved. To wherever Lily was. That afternoon, Beatrice drove to the town library.
She didn't know what she was searching for, but she needed something, anything, that would explain this stranger who appeared every Christmas Eve. The librarian, Mrs. Hargreaves, had been working there for 42 years.
A woman who remembered faces the way other people remembered dates.
When Beatrice described the man, his Victorian coat, the lantern, the way he stood perfectly still, Mrs. Hargreaves didn't laugh.
She didn't dismiss it as holiday theatrics.
She simply closed her drawer, removed her glasses, and said in a low voice,
"You're not the first one to see him." Beatrice's pulse tightened.
Mrs. Hargreaves turned, whispered for a moment as she searched for a key, then unlocked a cabinet filled with old binders and thin, fading ledgers. She pulled out one labeled Winter Incidents, 1890s.
"Back then," the librarian said quietly, "people wrote about things.
Not everything made it into newspapers, but families kept private logs, and some of them ended up here."
She flipped to a brittle page dated December 1892.
There, taped delicately to the page, was a small drawing.
Black ink.
Shaky strokes.
But the image was unmistakable. A man in a long winter coat. Holding a lantern. Standing at a family's window. Beatrice's chest tightened.
Next to the sketch was a note written in careful cursive.
He sang for her again. The hymn we cannot name. She breathed easier this time.
Another entry, a week later.
"Clara woke with strength today.
But my brother Thomas, he weakens instead.
Something is not right." And then, one final line. "We must warn others.
His gift comes at a cost." Beatrice stared at the page until her eyes blurred.
A date in the margin caught her attention.
December 25, 1892. Child, Clara Huxley, recovered fully.
Father, Thomas Huxley, dead 3 days later. Cause unknown.
The room felt colder. As though someone had stepped behind her. Beatrice whispered.
"What, was he?"
Mrs. Hargreaves closed the ledger gently, like sealing a secret. "A father," she replied.
"A father who couldn't let go."
Beatrice felt a sudden sting behind her eyes.
"And the children he visits." The librarian's voice softened even more. "He doesn't heal them, dear. He replaces them."
Beatrice's breath faltered.
Replaces them.
Before she could respond, Mrs. Hargreaves leaned forward, lowering her tone to something almost like a confession.
The song, the one you heard, does your daughter hum it? Beatrice's heart dropped. She does. Mrs. Hargreaves shut the cabinet. You need to be careful now. Because once the song is inside them, he never leaves.
Later that evening, Beatrice sat on the couch, staring at the living room window.
Every shadow felt unfamiliar. Every flicker of streetlight looked like a lantern blow.
Lily played on the floor, drawing shapes in the carpet with her fingers, humming the same haunting tune.
Beatrice forced her voice steady. Sweetie, where'd you hear that song? Lily paused, thinking. I didn't. I just feel like someone wants me to. He doesn't talk, he just listens.
Beatrice froze.
Who listens? Lily pointed toward the window. The man with the light. Beatrice's throat tightened. When did you see him? Last night. He smiled at me.
Beatrice's vision clouded for a moment, an instinctive panic rising so quickly it burned behind her ribs.
But Lily wasn't frightened. She wasn't unsettled. She looked comforted.
As though whatever stood in the dark last night had become familiar to her.
Like a lullaby she didn't know she knew. Beatrice swallowed hard and whispered, more to herself than to her daughter. I won't let him take anything from us.
But the truth hung heavy in the air.
Not yet spoken, but already understood. He already had.
Soft, steady, as though speaking to one person in a quiet room.
Beatrice didn't sleep that night.
She kept the lights low, letting the living room fall into that half-darkness where objects hold their shapes but shadows feel too patient, too aware. Lily rested on the couch, drawing again, humming that small, repeating melody. Beatrice watched her daughter's fingers.
Steady. Strong. Alive. And for a moment, a fragile moment, she thought. Asterisk, if he's helping her, why does it feel like something is slipping out of me instead?
She didn't tell Lily, but she felt weaker that day.
A dull ache deep in her chest.
A stiffness behind her eyes. As though a long night's exhaustion had wrapped itself around her bones.
She chalked it up to stress. Fear. The kind of worry only a parent can't outrun.
But the truth was waiting for her.
And it would reveal itself slowly. Quietly. The same way the caroler did.
The next morning, she returned to the library. Mrs. Hargreaves was already waiting, as if she expected her. I found something more, the librarian whispered, sliding over a binder that looked almost too fragile to touch.
Family notes from the Huxley household.
These were never meant for public eyes.
Beatrice opened it gently.
The pages were uneven, stitched by hand.
The ink faded but still legible.
The first entry struck her immediately.
December 21st, 1892. Clara is weakening.
Thomas cannot bear the thought of losing her. He spends his nights wandering outside, as if searching for a miracle.
A few pages later. December 23rd. He met a traveler at dusk. The man carried a lantern and wore a winter coat older than the style of men today. The man said nothing, he only sang. Then. December 24th. Clara breathed easier this morning. But Thomas looks pale. He claims he slept little, yet he refuses to say more. And finally. December 26th. He is gone. No injury. No sign of struggle. Only, drained.
But our Clara stands tall today, as if the sickness never touched her. Beatrice shut the book, her pulse tapping against her ribs. Someone must have noticed, she whispered.
Someone must have connected it.
Mrs. Hargreaves nodded grimly. Every generation had one family with a sick child who suddenly improved. And every time, an adult disappeared or weakened beyond explanation. She pulled out a folder. Inside were photocopies of Old Town reports, death records, missing persons notices, short newspaper clippings no one paid attention to back then.
Beatrice scanned them. 1918, child survives influenza. Mother dies the same winter. 1934, boy recovers from scarlet fever. Uncle collapses in his sleep. 1957, girl walks again after long illness.
Grandmother passes unexpectedly.
1980, child recovers from pneumonia. Father fades, doctors say. 2003, toddler heals overnight.
Babysitter hospitalized the next week, no cause found.
Different decades. Different illnesses. Different families. But always the same pattern. Always the same night. Always Christmas Eve.
Beatrice felt her knees weaken. Mrs. Hargreaves rested a hand over hers.
He never takes from the child, Ench whispered.
He takes from whoever loves the child most. Beatrice closed her eyes because she already felt the truth settling inside her like frost.
Her strength. Her energy. Her life. It wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't stress. It was the beginning. That night, Beatrice sat at her kitchen table, hands clasped tight. She needed answers. Not history. Not whispers. Not theories. She needed the truth about the man himself. So she drove to the town records office. The building was old, the kind of place where time collected in corners. The archivist, a retired historian named Walter Grimm, looked startled when she asked for files on the Huxley family. He hesitated a long moment before speaking. "You're not the first to ask about them," he said quietly. "Only, most people don't ask until they've already seen him." Beatrice's breath stilled. "You know who he is?" Walter nodded once. "He was Thomas Huxley. A teacher. A man loved by the whole community. He and his daughter, Clara, were inseparable. After she fell ill, he spent every night outside her window, hoping the cold would keep him awake long enough to take care of her." Walter pulled out a photo, grainy, sepia-toned, barely preserved. A man in a long Victorian coat. A faint lantern beside him. Eyes that looked tired, yet full of devotion. "He died 3 days after Clara recovered," Walter continued. "But people swore they saw him again the next Christmas Eve." He lowered his voice. "And the next. And the next. Always singing the same hymn, one no one could identify." Beatrice stared at the photograph, her throat tightening. "What does he want now?" Walter leaned back, exhaling slowly. "A father never stops trying to save his child," he said. "Not even in death." "But these children aren't his," Beatrice whispered. Walter looked at her with a kind of sadness that felt heavier than fear. "No. But the moment he lost his daughter, he began searching for another child who stood at the edge of life. He learned how to give them what he couldn't give Clara." Beatrice swallowed. "And what does he take, in return?" Walter looked her straight in the eyes. "The same thing he gave his own daughter. Time." Beatrice felt her breath shatter. "He's already begun, hasn't he?" Walter didn't answer. He didn't need to. Beatrice felt it in her bones. Her life. Her years. Had already begun slipping into Lily's hands. When Beatrice returned home, the street was quiet, washed in winter darkness. As she approached her front door, she froze. Lily was sitting on the living room floor. No television. No toys. Just sitting. Humming. The same tune. The same quiet sway of her head. Beatrice stepped inside. "Sweetheart?" Lily looked up. "He came back," she said softly. "He was standing outside. I didn't open the window. I just listened for a little bit." Beatrice's heart clenched. "What did he do?" Lily smiled faintly. "He just sang. It made me feel warm." Beatrice knelt, her voice trembling despite how hard she fought to steady it. "Lily, did he say anything?" Lily shook her head. No. He never talks. He just looks at me. She paused, thinking. And then he looks at you. Beatrice felt something collapse inside her. What do you mean? Lily pointed to the window. He watches you after he sings. Like he's making sure you heard the song too. Beatrice didn't breathe for several seconds. Because she had heard it. Every note. Every breath. Pressed into her like a hand leaving a mark. Lily leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. Mommy. I'm not scared, she whispered. He won't hurt me. Beatrice touched her daughter's hair. I know he won't, she whispered. But the thought she didn't say aloud. The truth she had come to accept. Was that he wasn't after her daughter? He was after the person who loved her enough to pay the price. And Beatrice would pay it. Soft, intimate, tense. For the following nights, the rhythm of Beatrice's life changed. It was subtle at first. The little aches she had dismissed as fatigue now lingered. Her fingers stiffened slightly in the mornings. Her eyes felt heavy or blurred at times. A shadow seemed to fall over her movements, almost imperceptible but relentless. She told herself it was stress. Exhaustion from sleepless nights and worry for her daughter. But deep inside, she knew better. Lily, on the other hand, grew brighter. Her laughter became lighter, freer, more effortless than it had been in months. Her cheeks flushed with health. Her coughs ceased. Her fever was gone. And with each day, the song came back. Not loud. Not demanding. A quiet murmur drifting through the house. Through the trees. Through the night. Sometimes, Beatrice would hear it in the early morning hours. A faint melody, carried across the cold winter air. And she knew he was near. Watching. Waiting. Calculating. One evening, as Beatrice prepared a simple dinner, she noticed it. Her reflection in the window, pale, hollow-eyed, faint strands of gray at her temples she hadn't noticed before. Her hands slightly weaker, trembling ever so subtly when she lifted the kettle. The floorboards creaked under her weight in a way they never had. And the clocks. They were all a minute behind. Then 2. Then 3. Time itself seemed to be bending around her. Not Mara. Not the house. Horror. She sank into a chair, watching Lily set her dolls in a circle. The child hummed again, unaware of the shifting shadows that lingered behind the walls. Beatrice's lips trembled as she whispered. I'm giving you my years, and you don't even know it. That night, she felt it in the air before she saw him. The wind carried a faint note, soft, distant, but unmistakable. The hymn. Elias Whitford's song. She stepped to the window. And there he was. Closer this time. Not at the end of the yard. Not near the trees. Standing under the faint glow of a street lamp, just beyond the gate. Hat low. Lantern swinging gently. Coat trailing in the snow. He didn't move. He didn't approach. But the pull in her chest, the subtle tug she had begun feeling for days, was stronger than ever. Her life itself seemed to be stretching toward him. Beatrice swallowed hard. She knew this was the moment. She stepped outside, boots crunching in the snow. The night air bit at her cheeks. The melody grew, just slightly louder, almost as if encouraging her forward. Elias Whitford didn't speak. He didn't have to. Everything she needed to understand was in his posture, in the way he watched her. The way he waited. The price revealed. Beatrice reached out, holding the air above his hand. A warmth met her fingers. Not tangible. Not solid. But undeniable. Then she felt it. The first fragment of time slipping away. A year, perhaps. A week, maybe. She couldn't measure it exactly, but she knew it was hers to give. And she did. Without hesitation. Without. That evening, the house was silent except for the faint hum of the old heater. Mara played quietly, unaware. Beatrice sat by the window, watching the dark yard. The streetlights flickered.
The snow fell softly.
Then she heard it. The hymn. Not distant this time. Not faint.
It surrounded her.
Encased her.
The song that had saved her daughter was here to claim the balance.
Elias stood at the edge of the gate. Lantern swinging. Coat brushing the snow. He did not move closer. He did not speak. He waited. Beatrice understood, tonight was the point of no return.
She whispered, almost to herself.
I'm ready. Take what you need. Keep her safe.
The air shivered. The snow paused.
Time itself seemed to inhale.
And for the first time, Elias Whitford's figure seemed less like a shadow. And more like a father, grieving still, yet offering hope. Soft, deliberate, almost a whisper in the listener's ear.
The night was still.
Thick snow fell across the yard, each flake tumbling lazily, silently, as though the world had slowed in anticipation.
Beatrice stood at the edge of her porch.
The wind caught her hair, tugging at it gently, but she barely noticed. Her hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the weight she had carried for weeks, 4 months, 4 years compressed into these last moments.
And there he was. Elias Whitford.
The man who had waited over a century to correct a wrong.
Hat brim low. Lantern dim.
Coat brushing the snow like a shadow in motion.
He did not move closer. He did not speak. He simply waited. Beatrice drew in a slow, shuddering breath.
This is it, she whispered. Her voice broke slightly, though no one heard it but the night.
I give you everything I am. Take what you must. Keep her alive. A quiet wind stirred. The lantern light shimmered.
And for the first time, Elias Whitford lowered his head slightly as if bowing to her courage, to her love, to her sacrifice. She stepped forward, her fingers reaching toward the space above.
Thought. Because the alternative, Mara's sickness returning, was unthinkable.
The pull deepened.
Slowly, methodically. Her knees weakened. Her breath hitched.
And outside, the snow carried the faint echo of his song.
Soft, longing, patient. Beatrice awoke before dawn.
Her body felt different. Older.
Hollow in the places she hadn't noticed before. Her reflection in the kitchen window confirmed it. Gray strands more visible. Skin thinner. Eyes heavier. But Mara.
Mara ran through the living room, healthy and full of life.
Mommy! Look! She shouted, spinning around. Beatrice smiled.
But it was strained.
Heavy with understanding. Her time was gone.
And Mara's was renewed. Beatrice returned to the historical society once more. Evan had been expecting her. You're feeling it now, he whispered.
Beatrice nodded. My body. I can feel the years leaving.
Evan gestured toward a wall lined with old photos and documents.
Look closely. Every family he visited, the adult who loved the child most suffered in the same way. Gray hair. Weakness. Slower heartbeats. Shortened life.
But the children, they flourished. He handed her a ledger.
Names, dates, children, parents.
The same pattern repeated for decades, over a century.
And at the bottom, one entry in modern handwriting.
Beatrice N., 2025, daughter recovers fully. Mother begins fading.
Witnessed. Beatrice gasped.
The words confirmed what she already felt.
Her life, already in fragments, was now recorded, documented. Irrevocable. That evening, the house was silent except for the faint hum of the old heater. Mara played quietly, unaware. Beatrice sat by the window, watching the dark yard. The streetlights flickered.
The snow fell softly. Then she heard it. The hymn. Not distant this time. Not faint. It surrounded her. Encased her. The song that had saved her daughter was here to claim the balance. Elias stood at the edge of the gate. Lantern swinging. Coat brushing the snow. He did not move closer. He did not speak. He waited. Beatrice understood, tonight was the point of no return. She whispered, almost to herself. I'm ready. Take what you need. Keep her safe. The air shivered. The snow paused. Time itself seemed to inhale. And for the first time, Elias Whitford's figure seemed less like a shadow. And more like a father, grieving still, yet offering hope. Soft, deliberate, almost a whisper in the listener's ear. The night was still. Thick snow fell across the yard, each flake tumbling lazily, silently, as though the world had slowed in anticipation. Beatrice stood at the edge of her porch. The wind caught her hair, tugging at it gently, but she barely noticed. Her hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the weight she had carried for weeks, 4 months, 4 years compressed into these last moments. And there he was. Elias Whitford. The man who had waited over a century to correct a wrong. Hat brim low. Lantern dim. Coat brushing the snow like a shadow in motion. He did not move closer. He did not speak. He simply waited. Beatrice drew in a slow, shuddering breath. This is it, she whispered. Her voice broke slightly, though no one heard it but the night. I give you everything I am. Take what you must. Keep her alive. A quiet wind stirred. The lantern light shimmered. And for the first time, Elias Whitford lowered his head slightly, as if bowing to her courage, to her love, to her sacrifice. She stepped forward, her fingers reaching toward the space above. His outstretched hand. The warmth met her skin immediately, not hot, not tangible, but unmistakable. A tug at the very core of her being. And then it began. It was not sudden. It was not violent. It was a slow, inexorable flow. She felt it first in her chest. A hollowing, a soft stretching of years away from her. Then her arms. Her legs. Her back. Every breath she took felt borrowed, measured, slipping through her fingers. And through the window behind them, in the safety of her home, Mara slept peacefully. Color returned to her cheeks. Strength returned to her limbs. Breath came easily. Her body, whole. Beatrice closed her eyes. A tear slid down her cheek. Not for fear. Not for regret. But for the life she had given away. The wind carried a note of that old hymn, clear and steady. Not sad anymore, not searching. A song of completion. Of balance restored. Elias Whitford stood quietly. He had given her daughter the time he once could not give his own. He had claimed what remained of the mother who loved fiercely enough to surrender herself. And then, with the same stillness that had defined him for decades, he vanished. Not like a ghost fading. Not like smoke. But like the final note of a song that had been sung one last time, leaving only silence and memory behind. Beatrice awoke the next morning in her bed. The room was still. The snow had melted slightly, leaving icy crystals on the windowsill. She moved carefully, realizing almost immediately. Something had changed. Her body felt lighter but weaker. Her limbs stiff, her eyes heavy. Her hair streaks of gray more prominent than the day before. But Mara. Mara ran through the living room with laughter, spinning and twirling, alive in a way Beatrice had never seen before. Beatrice smiled through the ache. It was the smile of a mother who had paid everything, who had traded years for a chance at her child's life. And though her body carried the weight of her sacrifice, her heart was unbroken. Years later, Mara would remember fragments. A melody she couldn't name. A tune that sometimes floated through her dreams, just out of reach. She would remember that it was a song her mother had somehow given to her.
without ever speaking a word. Mara grew strong, full of life.
She remembered her mother with love, always. And somewhere deep in her heart, she knew. Her mother had given everything so that she could survive, could thrive, could live. And though Beatrice faded quietly over the years, her sacrifice was never forgotten.
The legend persisted in the small town.
Every Christmas Eve, people whispered of the lone caroler. A song drifting through windows. A father searching. A reminder that love, even beyond death, could bend time itself.
And in the quietest moments, if you listened, you could almost hear the faintest echo of a mother's sacrifice. A hymn too tender to remember, too heavy to ever forget.